introduction. I'm delighted to be here at the University of Vermont. I'm actually a relatively new part-time resident of Vermont, way down in southern Vermont in Brattleboro. So I'm delighted to be able to be here at the University of Vermont. So yeah, the subject is Mexico's community forest in the Anthropocene. And yeah, happy to see a full house, even if it's a small house. This audience will be very familiar with the concept of natural climate solutions. So I'm here to propose that Mexico's community forests are both a natural climate solution in that it's a community-based effort that protects forests, manages forests better, and restores forests. So it hits several of the key points of natural climate solutions. And it's thus a people-centered natural climate solution. And it's also, the next slide is going to say, I'll be proposing that it's one of the seeds of a good Anthropocene. This audience will also be very familiar with the concept of the Anthropocene, so I don't need to go into that. The talk is based on my book from 2020, University of Arizona Press. But if you read my 1,000-word article in the conversation, you don't have to read the book. So you can Google Bray Conversation Mexico, that will come up. And so yes, I'll also be proposing, I'll come back to this at the end, that Mexico's community forest enterprises are one of the seeds of a good Anthropocene. So for those of you who don't know Mexico, just briefly, where are the forests of Mexico? That's not working at that angle, it doesn't seem. So anyway, yeah, so the dark purple is the tropical forest in the Yucatan Peninsula along the coast. The lighter green is the temperate, I'll be gesturing to the screen that I'm seeing in the back there. The light greens are the Sierra Madre Oriental, and Sierra Madre Occidental, which are the temperate forest of Mexico, the pine and oak forest. And that's where the most, let's say the most successful community forest enterprises are, because temperate forests, pine forests, are easier to manage than the tropical forest. But there's also successful experiences in the tropical forest, particularly in the state of Quintana Roo. There's a lot of complicated things here, and I don't want to overemphasize the role of social capital. The other capitals, financial capital, natural capital, are physical capital. I might have trouble coming up with all five on the spur of the moment, but governance of the Mexican communities and Mexican community forest enterprises is very important, and it really several things here about, I'm sure a number of you are familiar with the work of Elinor Ostrom, but a number of things here about Elinor Ostrom, that the governance forms in Mexican communities came from above. They were not developed by the communities. So they had reduced transaction costs because of this, because coming out of the Mexican agrarian reform, the Mexican Revolution, if you know anything about your Mexican history in the second decade of the 20th century, it, among other things, provided a governance template for all Mexican rural communities based on assemblies and what is called the Comisariado, Consejo de Vigilancia, the oversight councils. And there's a long history here. I'm not going to go into this, but the first one, it goes back to the Mexican Agrarian Revolution. The Mexican government, through public policy, was very important in the creation of the sector. So there's a number of moments there. The early 1970s, the period of the presidency of Echeverria, was a very important moment of reforms from above that opened possibilities for community forest enterprises, but that were vigorously taken up by the local community. So it was very much a dialectical process in a Marxist sense. And so, one of the important things, the endowments of natural capital that came from this agrarian reform, the focus was really on distribution of agricultural lands. But as part of the process, forest lands also ended up being handed out. And already by 1980, The current number, about 60% of Mexican forests are considered to be in the hand directly owned by communities with a nearly full bundle of rights, if you know the Ostrom language on that. The forest extraction, the logging is regulated by the Mexican government, but they have full property rights. And some of this is quite recent, 1970s, which was the period of Luis Echeverria. Some of the largest distributions of forest lands took place, and that's just the distribution by presidential period. And so, yeah, particularly in the 70s, it was the reforms from above. There was a Mexican government agency that you can read the quote there. That's actually from the young man with the very bushy hair there, Alfonso Gonzalez Martinez, who actually worked for a government agency that was out organizing communities to form their own community forest enterprises. And so, yeah, particularly important, the presidency of Luis Echeverria, big timber parastatals, which also served as regional development organizations, a government agency called FONAFI, training centers with professionals providing all sorts of different skills, a new wave of reform, distribution of forest lands, and that's the initials for one of the other important government agencies. So they're in all the major forest regions of Mexico. The number varies from year to year, depending on various things, but one recent estimate is there's something over 1,600 communities with logging permits, and over half of these have varying degrees of vertical integration, from logging trucks up to sawmills. Some of the most sophisticated ones have millions of dollars worth of assets, including sawmills, furniture factories, plywood factories in some cases. So it's really pretty remarkable. For this academic audience, I'm going to go into a little social theory here, and because there's major implications for theory and policy, and the theory of the economic markets, forest sector reform policies, and resilience of ecological systems, adaptation to climate change. So I'm going to try to march through all of these in the next few minutes. Yeah, as I said, I take my intellectual marching orders from Eleanor Ostrom, but my argument is in the book that Mexican community forestry requires significant extensions of her theories to account for what happened in Mexico. I'll go into some of that. But the tragedy of the commons, for this audience, I won't take the time to explain that. But here, communities own the forest, they talk to each other, they communicate with each other, they set rules on their use with some significant exceptions that I'll get to, manage them for the commercial production of timber and all sorts of non-timber forest products. So yeah, 60% of the forests are owned by communities. In the state of Oaxaca, where we have particularly done a lot of work, it's over 80%. For those of you who don't read Spanish, this is the sign outside one of the well-known community forest enterprises in the Sierra Norte of Oaxaca, Ixtlan de Juarez. In this community, private property does not exist. The buying and selling of communal lands is prohibited in big red letters. Attentively, the community authorities. The modifications to common property theory, yes, state policy was crucial in the creation of sector, what Ostrom calls a facilitative political regime. Although in her discussion of facilitative political regimes, she mostly focused on her early work on groundwater in Southern California. That some of that kind of disappeared in her later work. And yeah, as I said, a state supply of community governance institutions, where Ostrom is very focused on communities being able to set their own rules. In Mexico, many of the rules came from above. Particularly, it's very important for Ostrom that harvest rules, that how you exploit, harvest the resource. It's very important that the rules about that be in the hands of the community, because they are the ones closest to the resource. Mexican logging, forest extraction in Mexico is very heavily regulated by the Mexican government. So the harvest rules came from above. So why didn't, in Ostrom's terms, it crowd out selective action around the forest if so many rules were imposed from above? My argument is because they have a very valuable commodity timber, which usually has good prices in the marketplace. And so they have a market incentive to not have their collective action being brought up. And so among other things, I think this was one of the most successful reforms from above, again, with vigorous community response. I don't know all the comparisons, but I think it just has to be one of the most successful reforms of the entire economic sector in the world, as that says. Because, you know, most of what you read about environmental degradation, destruction, the role of capitalism in forests and local communities throughout the world, you hear about, you know, conflicts of ecological distribution, resistance. What happened in Mexico through a series of reforms and bigger community response, it created a kind of protected economic area where these community forest enterprises were allowed to develop. They're also highly resilient. A lot of the resilience literature, which I'm sure you're familiar with, really focuses on social capital. As like there's a couple of quotes there from Neil Adger and Fickert Brooks that make this argument that resilience is based on social capital. Just briefly, Mexicans see it's not just social capital, they're politically resilient, economically resilient, ecological resilient, socially resilient, and this has emerged due to a complex historical process. There was no one key there. Ostrom's signature project, E3, based on data from 200 communities in 10 countries, a very large scale project. It was a series of use of these large databases by her students and colleagues over the years. And they come up with conclusions, you know, I won't read all that, but forests with a higher, with a higher probability of regeneration are likely to be small to medium size, low levels of subsistence dependence, low commercial value, and you can take a look at but none of this is what happens in Mexican community forests. This is from Ostrom herself. Very large territories are unlikely to be self-organized given the high cost of defining boundaries, and so on, monitoring use patterns and gaining ecological knowledge. And so she concludes that moderate territorial size is most conducive. One more, Lauren Persha, 84, found that local rulemaking is crucial along with some other things, but I don't know. I think there were some Mexican cases in that database, but they didn't come up appropriately because there's successful examples of Mexican community forestry in all size ranges from a few hundred hectares to over 100,000 hectares. So it's not size dependent, as Ostrom suggested. They're all managed for commercial value, not subsistence value, and in general, it's not degraded. And as I said, local rulemaking on the harvest rules is also all the harvest rules come from above. So this is why it requires very significant modifications to Ostrom's theories. It's a very large sector. Not everything's great in it, but the most important impact, negative impact today are from organized crime in Mexico. No Mexican government has been able to control organized crime, so there's serious impact depending on the region, with some enterprise from where they're being directly taken over by organized crime to where they have to pay protection, like the mafia in the United States at times. They provide good paying jobs, profitable at all levels of vertical integration. There's a lot of data on that. Thousands of relatively well-paying jobs with benefits, very unusual in rural Mexico. My colleague, Juan Manuel Torres Rojo, who is the co-author of the economics chapter in the book, also documented poverty alleviation impacts. Finally, on climate change, the IPCC and their 2018 report that was focused on forests, what can be done with forests for keeping climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and they suggest things, forest degradation, deforestation, use of local indigenous knowledge, biodiversity management, and community-based adaptation. It's my frustration that they didn't mention Mexican community forestry, which I would argue is one of the most sophisticated and mature responses of both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Still overlooked and still little known pre-adaptation. It's a form of community-based adaptation, you can say, but goes well beyond that. Forests in the Amazon are considered to be close to a tipping point of forest loss. But I would argue that Mexico's community forests are a frontline adaptation to modifying the rate and direction of forest ecosystem response to climate change. That quote from Difficult and Field is not about Mexican community forests. It works. In mitigation to climate change, fifth largest carbon storage globally in Mexican forest. It has some of the most well-known examples of sale of carbon credits in the voluntary markets in the Sierra Sur, where communities have agreements to offset the carbon. Palo Alto, the city of Palo Alto, California, the Walt Disney Company, and Duke University, as well as some major Mexican corporations. And the other important point to be made here is that sustainably managed forests store more carbon than protected forests. Why is that? Because the harvested timber goes into what is called the slow pool of carbon. If you've just got a protected forest, yes, it's and more recent evidence over the last 10 years suggests that mature forest growing forests are still capturing significant amounts of carbon, but not as much as if you're harvesting both the timber and the carbon, then you get more vigorous tree growth, and that carbon goes into the slow pool in construction and furniture. So yeah, final comments on the Anthropocene. You all know what the Anthropocene is, so I don't need to belabor that. There's all, generally very negative in its connotations, but there's also, which you may possibly not be familiar with, there's a proposal that a good Anthropocene is possible. We know what we need to do to be able to reduce carbon emissions and put the planet on a more sustainable path that it's on right now. And there's some of the Earl Ellis at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County is one of the leaders on this. And so, but what I've seen in the Good Anthropocene literature, they still haven't incorporated Mexican community forestry, but it's my proposal that they are among the seeds of a good Anthropocene. So, thank you. I'm able to say similar to good.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. So I am going to continue with the same, but not the same. The first message, it is community forests are a big sector, but none of them are supported in timber. Others, any of them have people, and also they have culture and biodiversity. How it may work, that is the question. And I am going to talk more about that phase of the community forest. First, at all, bad news. This is a very recent publication, just few months ago, and some models predict, say, IUCN red list was the base for recognize the problems with the foundation. Also, they support the ideas with the 6 mass extinction in the planet, but the perspective is war than this. So, what we can do? Mexico is considered part of the mega diverse countries in the world. And criteria include not only species diversity, but endemisms, and also diversity of ecosystems. So if you remember the map that David presented about forests, it is true, but also all of them, even dry and desert ecosystem, harbor a lot of diversity. That diversity has been protected for more than a century before the conservation biology appears as a branch of biology. So this is the first book published in the 80s, but we have a long history of protection of our forests, and we share some history with you. But this timeline may recognize the most important events. I want to emphasize before the World Park Congress in Durban, South Africa, it prevails a strict conservation as the main criteria, and the idea is people cannot coexist with biodiversity. So the exclusion policy prevails, but in Durban and after that, it was recognized indigenous people and maybe tribal groups around the world preserve biodiversity and ecosystems, and also they can use lands in different ways, and biodiversity could be there. So that was a turning point about the perspective, how we can promote conservation. But in 2008, probably Mexico was located in a different context compared with the rest of the world. And basically the idea, it is because, as David mentioned, the land distribution as a result of the Mexican Revolution. Probably you heard about one of these legendary hero, Emiliano Zapata, and farmers asked, we want land and freedom, but they never asked it. We want land and forest, we want land and biodiversity. But with the land distribution, a lot of people in almost the complete country receive lands, and legally they start to have some rights with the natural resources, including forest products, and also biodiversity. But now, since 2008, the Mexican law include a new category. We have regulations for protected areas in federal lands, but because it was a new regulation, it calls áreas voluntarias de conservación, voluntary conservation areas. The process, it was a bit different, no decrees, but government certified the local initiatives, private, and also common property to protect areas. So before that, who has the rights legally to protect biodiversity was government. But after 2008, it was a kind of democratization of the right to preserve biodiversity. So we have this very important political instrument, and what happened if at least more than 30,000 properties were part of the communities and ejidos. So as you can imagine, in that moment, the top-down strategy was mixed with a bottom-up strategy, and the paradigm started changing in Mexico, probably in other places around the world, but here we have the common property and the legal instrument to involve people. We may talk about two periods of time. In the first case, more than 100 years. In the other case, relatively young model of public policy for conservation. We see these dynamics. It was a publication in 2020, but you cannot imagine how the numbers are changing now. Tendency is still maintained. If you see in the first graph, there are presidential periods, but when voluntary conservation areas appears, it was not possible, but almost impossible. Protected areas declarations can be worse in Mexico because people reject established because they are they can impose and people don't want. But when voluntary conservation appears, people start attracted by them. And the question is why? They are owners of the land, they consider they have a very rich territories, and people embrace this new model. And the last good news, just in September 28th, so some days ago, we have new voluntary conservation areas, but the size of them is 430,000 hectares. So it is not a small surface, but basically it is tropical perennial forest. So, and two communities decide to preserve these lands. If we see the map, this land is updated immediately because the process is going so fast. But here I want to emphasize with the first model top-down, basically natural values were considered as the most important criteria. But with the voluntary conservation, it starts to have another phase. Probably natural values are still important, but natural resources use is encouraged, is possible, is openly accepted as a conservation strategy. But probably the second point is the most important, because communities can protect their territories against minery and oil extraction and some developable projects. So big investment to highways or another projects can be stopped if you have voluntary conservation areas. So in general, farmers don't trust government, but they recognize they have a legal instrument to be protected. And also mitigation of climate change and social improvement is considered in the goals. So David mentioned how important is the timber as an incentive to try to do a good management in forestry areas. But here with biodiversity, that market potentially exists, but there are not big budgets. So besides the protection, there are another not financial possibilities, but with this strategy, people is the heart of the strategy. Thank you. So they have rights to administrate and management as the people need. But the other is they can produce different products, and particularly food security is one important issue for communities in Mexico. So apparently some financial incentives can be available, but particularly markets are not working well with environmental service payments and other products. Non-financial incentives are very important, but probably I want to emphasize one of them for the future. It is a local social learning for conservation. Can you understand kids, young people, and also adults may understand better how important are their territories? They are involved in many activities to know better not only conservation language concepts, to be in contact with professionals or more technical aspects, but also probably they may understand how important it is to have more sustainable territories. In this perspective, when we consider biodiversity crisis feature as climate change among the most important environmental issues in this time, we have this model. But unfortunately, there is not well known outside from Mexico and even into Mexico as very recently. So I am so happy Mexico can be featured from you or other people to understand how great it was the community forest there. And here you may see a program to monitoring biodiversity in community lands, but it is a kind of sophisticated technical methods to have a good wildlife and plants monitoring. But the local people, despite they are farmers, they go to the milpa, they go to cultivate coffee or another issues like they need in rural places. They can recognize species, they may know they are endangered, they know they are endemic, so, and they are happy they are protecting them. So that's all, thank you.